Yes, yes. Today we're talking about the sovereign citizen movement. I am Anawultus, a flesh and blood person. Happy to be here. Of course, last episode was on the trial of King Charles I on my channel, and the next episode of this series will also be on my channel as we are alternating each episode. Yes, I would characterize it as yeah. I would characterize it as them essentially saying that the normal types of laws that other people would consider as being as applying to people in this country, they don't think that those laws would apply to them. I think that that's a generalization. I don't think. Let me clarify that just real quick on the FBI. They consider it to be a domestic terror threat, and they consider it to be number in potentially the hundreds of thousands. However, I don't think that they consider it to be an organization. I think that's very important to clarify. Well, I think one reason would be if we're looking at an ideological perspective, some people might consider it to be an important element for upholding what they consider to be their rights as people living in this world. They might say their God-given rights or their constitutional rights. Now, of course, there's different views on the Constitution among different groups, but some people take that perspective. Generally speaking, there's a distinction between people that are really into it as an ideology and people that look at it more as something of convenience to them. So, for example, a lot of people enter into this type of movement because they might be in a lot of debt or they might be doing poorly financially. And people from the movement make promises that if they file paperwork the right way or if they uh, answer the right questions, do the right procedures legally, that they can get out of a lot of debt or perhaps make a lot of money. So, in that sense, it appeals to people that might be wanting to have money or might need money. At the same time, I think it's also important to note that there's also people that use it as a method for accomplishing frauds. Um, that is to say, these people might talk to people that are into the ideology, but they themselves are more interested in it as a way of exercising a fraud of some kind, such as real estate fraud, mortgage fraud, um, fraudulently uh, requiring fees for bogus legal work. That happens frequently. So in that sense, it is a way for people to make money. Although there are some people that are in it definitely for more ideological reasons. Or at least that's what the police's perspective of it is. license plate. Yeah, yeah, or in some cases they'll have a fake government license plate, which is probably a much bigger problem than having just a regular fake one. Yes, and the reason they don't have that, I think it's very important to say because we haven't really gotten into what their exact thought process is. The reason why they don't have a driver's license is because if they were to get a driver's license or other official documentation, they believe that that is essentially enjoining into a sort of social contract with the what they call the de facto government, um, to therefore make themselves responsible for particular elements of a law which they view as something that they should not be responsible to unless they choose to uh, interjoinder with that. So, in that sense, the understanding here is that by getting a driver's license, it makes you accountable to various commerce law codes that exist. However, the way the government treats it is not in this way. And that is where the disconnect comes between the policeman and the sovereign citizens, is that the policemen don't understand the law in the same way that the sovereign citizens do, and vice versa. And that leads to a huge disconnect whenever there is an interaction with them or with other public servants. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and that's another important distinction that they make in their terminology that is not made under the general U.S. code, is that they consider traveling and driving to be legally distinct acts. And therefore, if you are operating a vehicle or vessel, as they might call it, um, on a road, they might call it traveling instead of driving. And they believe that by using different terminology for it, that it makes them exempt to regulations in regards to driving. And part of this is based on an interpretation of the Articles of Confederation, Article 4, where they would consider themselves as being uh, free people in a state that have the same rights as the citizens of a state. However, I think they don't read a further clause that says that they are also subject to the same restrictions as the citizens of a state if they are in a state. So, and then there's a good faith and credit clause as well. So, by misinterpreting the Article of Confederation in that way, they are essentially thinking that there's legal distinction being made that allows them to exist as a separate status from other people in the country, and that therefore they have the same access to the various rights as others, but that they have a different status and therefore don't have the same obligations. Whereas in the Articles of Confederation, it actually says that they would have the same restrictions and obligations, etc. But, of course, the Articles of Confederation are not in force as laws anymore due to the ratification of the US Constitution. So when somebody uses the Articles of Confederation to make such an argument, it is not a legally valid argument. Yes. So yeah. Yeah, so I'm saying that essentially a lot of it revolves around an alternative interpretation of legal statutes and of various ideas about common law. Yeah. Well, the argument they make on the 14th Amendment is actually an argument against the 14th Amendment. Um, and I think you're misunderstanding. They're not trying to use the 14th Amendment to support their actions. They're trying to essentially reject that the 14th Amendment applies to them. And I think the argument is because the 14th Amendment defines uh, the acquisition of citizenship, that it therefore counts as a different kind of citizenship from that which already existed in the United States. So, what they're arguing is that there are two types of citizenships in the United States. One that is older than the 14th Amendment, and another one established by the 14th Amendment. Now, uh, this means that the argument they're making is that they are citizens, but not citizens under the 14th Amendment, that they're following an older citizenship that pre-existed the 14th Amendment under what they would refer to as common law. Now, the problem with the common law idea here is that they're not using the term common law as it is used by anyone else. What they mean by common law is essentially a type of natural law and pre-existing law to statutes, whereas common law is generally understood as being law established through courts over time as cases arose that frequently interacted with statutes. So in that sense, they are saying that they are common law citizens and not statutory citizens, and that it's different. However, any regular understanding of common law would not consider that to be valid as an argument. So in that sense, I would say that if they wanted to say this, then they would have to prove it in some way from statutes, from the Constitution, and from court cases that support their idea. The problem is that they cannot support the idea that the United States has two different types of citizenship, a 14th Amendment citizenship and a common law citizenship. They cannot support this from any official statute, legal statute from the Constitution, or from any legal court established under the authority of Congress, which essentially renders their legal argument invalid to any court of the United States. Well, the hidden accounts. What you're talking about is the redemption idea, which is a bit different and emerged through a different understanding of the U.S. Shifting away from the gold standard. So that's a bit of a different idea to this. Now, of course, this idea that there's different types of U.S. citizenship and citizenship of the states being distinct from those as well leads to many. It leads to many sovereign citizens putting forth their renunciation of U.S. citizenship in a number of different ways, trying to file documents that have no official form and therefore are questionable. Now, the U.S. is participating in the UN, and one of the rules of the UN is that people can't not have a nationality of any kind. And therefore, by rejecting their US citizenship, which is linked and overlapping with state citizenship, even though they might not acknowledge that, they are essentially telling the US government to acknowledge something that the US government has promised they would never do, which is to abandon someone to having no nationality. So in that sense, that is something that the US government will not allow. Now, on the question of the secret bank accounts, this is an idea that is based on the US government going off of the gold standard. And the idea is that instead of simply moving on to a fiat system with fractional reserve, which is what most economists believe happened, uh, what the sovereign citizens, not all of them, some of them, let me be very clear, this is a subset that has a large overlap, but also there's probably some people that aren't sovereign citizens that also follow this idea as well. What they believe on the redemption movement is that instead of having a gold standard, the US moved to using humans as collateral for their currency, and that therefore each person, when they are born and given a birth certificate, have a shell corporation created that has a certain amount of money in it from the beginning, and that this is what the government uses as its monetary base. Now, the problem with this is that there's no evidence in any official documentation that this is the case. You could argue that Social Security is perhaps a sort of halfway inspiration toward how this might work, but Social Security is accessible to people under uh, various circumstances, and you don't automatically have money in Social Security. It's something that has to be put in over time. Now, what they do then is they believe that if they can file the right forms, that they can access this secret account that belongs to their legal person or straw man, which is a corporation and is separate from their own person, uh, and that by writing in the right paperwork, they can trick the government to accept bills sent to their straw man account rather than to their own flesh and blood person. So, in that sense, they believe that they can secretly access this account, and there's probably a lot of scam artists telling people that they can do this. And unfortunately for them, as far as I'm aware, this has never actually come to fruition. The U.S. government has never actually accessed a secret account and then paid out of somebody's strawman account. So the fact that this continues to be an attempt doesn't really make sense. And even if those accounts were real, I don't think that the government would simply accept a request from a non-government source asking to pay it out from there. So not going to happen, even if it were real. And I don't think it is. I have no evidence that it is real.
Right, right. Yeah, that was a very good explanation. Because I was a little bit confused on that part of it. I understood kind of the concept of it per se, but I didn't really understand how. I guess you could say someone would believe it. But that's not ultimately the main question when it comes to that. We were talking already a little bit about common law, so I don't necessarily think we need to talk about that because I think we covered that pretty well. The next one here is
Well,
commercial
I,
law.
I, I think there's an important part of common law,
Okay.
an important thing relating to common law. It's that they believe that they can establish common law grand juries,
Hmm.
and of course, this everything that we say they believe or that they do applies to some elements of the groups, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people that are law-abiding citizens and simply buy into this as an idea of something that's going on rather than actually something that they're participating in. Um, but what they do is they a number of sovereign citizens will get together and establish a common law grand jury, and they will subpoena people to appear before a common law grand jury, which, as far as I'm aware, has no legal standing under the laws of any state or of the federal government. And by subpoenaing people there, they assume to have some sort of legal authority over those people. Now, that being said, this, of course, is a legal problem, but it gets worse when they put out bounties on public officials that they dislike or that have disagreed with them in some way. And they might put out a dead or alive bounty on a public official. And that is, I will say, very criminal, and can get them in a lot of trouble when they do it.
And I'm assuming this would also refer to paper terrorism, is a word I've heard being referred to, where essentially they would
Yes.
bring the public figure in so much paper and drown them in debt is kind of the approach.
Well, it's not just an attack on public figures. Paper terrorism is whenever they file various forms in an attempt to perhaps get out of a situation that they're in trouble for, or to get somebody else into trouble, or to simply clog up the government system. And some of it might be legitimate, or probably not legitimate, but real paperwork, such as IRS forms indicating money transfers in excess of $10,000, which, if you apply that to a particular person, then the government might think that that person has a higher tax liability than they actually do, because if it's a fake form, that is, it's a real form, but it's filled out fakely, then the government might think that this person received income that this person has not actually received, or they might put a lien on somebody's home, and that can be difficult to deal with if you are interacting and trying to buy or sell that home later on, because it has a lien on it, and then the banks and whoever will look at it and say, we can't sell this, it has a lien on it. Or various other things, such as filing bogus paperwork that has no legal standing, or privately assigning fines for the use of somebody's name on official legal documents. That is another thing that happens. They say they will fine people, or they will put in frivolous lawsuits and a number of other things. And of course, there are laws against a lot of this in a number of different areas, especially on the federal side. Retaliation against officers of the law is criminal. So participation in a number of these different acts of paper terrorism can get someone into a significant amount of trouble.
Right. I believe that under law, judges and lawyers are also protected from that concept of paper terrorism, if I remember right. But I remember, if this is true from the video I watched, and you never know with YouTube, you don't always get straight facts. But the person was mentioning that a lot of like political people, judges, lawyers, and even politicians in a large part, have some provisions under law to protect them from those things. But regular people that may get in the way of sovereign citizens don't really have those protections. And she was arguing for the fact that there needs to be something made to protect just regular people, similar to how judges get protected. So I do know that there's probably some provision out
if you're
there,
just
but...
So if you're just a county clerk and a sovereign citizen comes in to do some dealings, and you have no idea what they're doing, and you end up rejecting their paperwork for whatever reason, then they might consider perhaps engaging in an act of paper terrorism as retaliation against you. And in order to deal with that, you might pay a lot of money in legal fees in order to resolve false liens or a number of other things. And that can be highly problematic.
Yes, of course. No, it's just crazy to me. But obviously, we're talking about more of the hardcore people now. And anyway, but the next concept here on this list is commercial law. I'm just going to read the first paragraph because I think it does a good job summarizing what commercial law is. Commercial law, most sovereigns make a distinction between common law citizens governed under the original Constitution and 14th Amendment. Citizens governed under the U.S. Code are commercial law, and are subject to the rules of the United States corporations. Some sovereigns refer to this supposed commercial law as arbitrary law, I think that's how you pronounce that, or the law of the sea, claiming this illegitimate law is based on principles of
Admiralty.
Admiralty law, or the law of sea, claiming this illegitimate law is based on principles of international commerce. So we have talked about this briefly. I just thought that did a good job summarizing it, and I also want to bring up the factor of an example that I've seen, where a lot of times, we mentioned it before, a lot of times these sovereign citizens, when they're driving, say that they're traveling. And the reason they use the phrase travel is because they're saying that it's for, commercial reasons. And that's, since it's for commercial reasons and they're traveling, it fits into their U.S. code, or the U.S. code they believe, and they can't be penalized because they're traveling and not driving.
No, they say they're traveling because they think it exempts them from the U.S. code.
Okay, right.
They're using a term that they believe is not covered under the terminology of laws relating to driving, so that by using different terminology, they believe that the officers of the law will not have the authority to enforce a number of laws related to traffic. Now, the idea of the U.S. Code being purely commerce or admiralty law is not something that is accepted by any U.S. court or by the Congress of the United States. Now, I can see where the idea came from in a number of different ways, because the U.S. Code is simply a collection of statutes of the United States relating to various issues. That is, the laws made by Congress and outside of constitutional amendments. So you have the constitutional amendments, which are statutes, and then the U.S. Code, which is the rest of the statutory law, which is of a lower status than the Constitution, but is still applicatory over the whole country. And the reason why they might make this argument is because a number of elements of the U.S. Code are justified under the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, relating to governing interstate commerce. But I think it's fair to say that the substance of the U.S. Code is more than simply laws relating to trade. So even if they were justified under commerce, I think the substance of a law is more than just commerce. And they might disagree with the legal doctrine that is being used by Congress and by the courts upholding the acts of Congress. But that is how due process works, unfortunately for them. If they have a problem with the U.S. Code, then they should make a lawsuit and have the Supreme Court or another federal court decide on the issue. And if they decide in their favor, then that will be good for them. But unfortunately for them, the Supreme Court and other U.S. courts simply aren't interested in interpreting the law in the way that they want to interpret it. So another thing that they say about the U.S. Code is that the U.S. Code refers to the United States of America, that is the U.S. government, as a corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe that by referring to it as a corporation, that it makes it different from the what they call the de jure government of the United States. They call it the de facto government as distinct from the de jure government. Now, that being said, I don't think that it's provable that there has been any lack of continuity between the government making that law and the government under previous laws. And that law is under a segment of the US Code referring to federal debt collection. And I think that defining the US government as a corporation doesn't actually change the status of the US government. I think rather than changing what the US government is or redefining it as something different, what it does is it affirms something that anybody that knows what a bureaucracy is already true, that the US government is necessarily a corporation if we are referring to it as a government that is distinct from both the governed and from the people doing the governing. That is, as a legal entity that can be sued without either the entire people of the US also being sued or the specific leaders of a country being sued. So when a lawsuit is being made against the United States, even before this part of the US Code, it is not being made against the president or against Congress or against the several states or against the people of the United States. It is being made against the United States of America, which is therefore understood to be a corporation, even if it is not explicitly said anywhere that it is a corporation. And I think that's something that's very important to understand about how governments work, how in modern times, is that they are necessarily corporations because of the way they operate, even if they are not explicitly called corporations.
Right. I think this also kind of leads its way to the idea of the fictitious person, kind of the idea that you can't sue. You can't sue. This is a weird one to me, but you can't sue Johnny because Johnny isn't a citizen really of the United States. But on the other hand, I am like Johnny's representative. You can see, or I'm Johnny's like spokesperson, or for in the court system is an example for that. But it's a weird concept.
Straw man.
Straw man. Yes, I'm the straw man, even though it's the same person. And if you do want to have a couple laughs, just search sovereign citizens in court, and you'll probably have a few laughs when it comes to that argument and judges. But
yeah. So the idea is, as we had mentioned before, that they consider their legal person, what appears on government documents, to be distinct from their flesh and blood person, the human being, the human male or female. They consider that to be distinct entities, legally speaking. And so when you have a birth certificate, a driver's license, or a subpoena, or a number of other legal documents, especially if it's all caps or capitalized or punctuated in a way different from the way that they capitalize or punctuate their names, because sometimes they are very explicit about how they like to capitalize their names and how they like to use punctuation in their names. And so when they see a document that doesn't do it the exact way that they would do it, they consider that to be referring to somebody else, more specifically to a straw man or a shell corporation that the government has established to hold accountable for a number of laws that they believe that if they don't enter into joinder, if they don't join into the legal system, if they don't join into and allow themselves to be held responsible for their straw man, that they therefore cannot be held accountable in court for various laws relating to the U.S. Code or a number of other different laws. Now, of course, the legal theory on this depends on what type of sovereign citizen you're looking at, because there are many different types. But generally speaking, you'll see this a lot, that they consider the person different from their flesh and blood. And then it's funny when a judge says, well, when you see the person, tell him he's also going to jail. So they'll just I saw a judge that simply said, well, I'm going to condemn both of you then. But I think it's interesting that they do this because, as I said before, the U.S. Code, the U.S. Constitution, U.S. court decisions don't make any of this distinction between the person or the flesh and blood, and because nobody legally is making that distinction, I think what they are doing is actually strawmanning the government, saying that the government is doing something that, and implying some legal doctrine that doesn't actually exist. They imagine that a legal fiction is being placed upon them to hold them accountable to some tyrannical idea, when in fact they are creating in their own minds a legal fiction that doesn't exist, and through that disconnect they get into a lot of trouble, legally speaking.
Right, right. A lot of these hardcore sovereign citizens end up going to court and having tickets quite often. It's kind of a constant cycle, it seems. From watching videos, you sometimes start to see the same people. But so that's the concept of their fictitious person, which I've seen pretty much all people use in examples I've watched, at least at some point. They talk about here on our next part the Declaration of Sovereignty, and I'll just read these next two paragraphs. The Declaration of Sovereignty. This frequently includes writing and filling a florid declaration of sovereignty that renounces the fictitious person and associated entities and claiming the rights and privileges of a common law citizen. The precise language varies. Declaration of sovereignty can often be very complex and appear incoherent to someone who is not versed in the movement's particular rules and pseudo-legal principles. This complexity has created space for opportunistic groups and individuals to sell legal filings, kits, and guidelines to would-be sovereigns, often for hundreds of dollars or more. So, if I'm understanding this point, this is essentially the idea of, like we said earlier, a lot of times they denounce citizenship of the United States. They're not bound to the U.S. law, really. At least some sovereign movements, at least. I'm not sure you could say all in this. But they tend to have their own laws and their own citizenship, especially when you talk about certain sovereign identity groups, and we're going to be getting to one here in a little bit. But the idea of this, like we mentioned before, is the paperwork. And a lot of times the paperwork becomes a major deal for cops all the way up to judges, because oftentimes in the courts, similar to the concept of paper terrorism, they'll put a whole bunch of their documents to flood the court system and to try to delay the process of eventually probably going to jail or getting the penalty for whatever crime they're in the court for. But the idea is essentially slowing the process down.
Yep. And of course, this idea of sovereignty is a bit different, or at least it's used a lot differently from how most people would understand sovereignty, because in the founding fathers, when they had this idea of popular sovereignty and of we the people, they're not referring to full-on voluntarism as a legal doctrine. What they're referring to is representative government. And so in that sense, they take the words that the founding fathers used and they interpret them quite differently from how the founding fathers uh, interpreted their own words and use them quite differently. So when the founding fathers said that the people had to be in charge in a number of different ways, they're not saying that each individual person has a right to full sovereignty in himself, and that therefore he can refuse to participate in various government activities. What they are saying is that each person has a right to representation in the government, and that therefore then the government gets to decide those various policies. Now, that being said, this makes them different from the person we talked about last week, which is King Charles the First of England when he went on trial, because he actually was the leader of the country. He was the sovereign of the country. And even he, when confronted with a court that did not like what he was doing, could not win. And therefore, I don't think that the sovereign citizens who are not sovereign under any usual definition of sovereignty, I don't think that they have a chance of having that sovereignty being acknowledged by any court, especially when they behave in a rude manner towards judges at times, or towards police officers.
Mm-hmm.
So, what, however, some of them do, and this is very rare, however, this is where the danger turns up to 11, is that some of them do understand that sovereignty implies a monopoly on violence. And when they have what they perceive to be their sovereignty threatened, they do attempt to acquire that monopoly. And that's where you see the violent encounters with police, where a regular traffic stop might turn into a gunfight. And this has happened at times. And that is, of course, it shows a better understanding of what sovereignty is, but it also shows a greater danger that leads to the US government being very concerned with ensuring that they don't achieve the sovereignty, because it would necessarily prejudice the sovereignty of Congress and the several states, which is not legal under the US Constitution. It is explicitly outlawed to prejudice the integrity, the territorial integrity of the United States and of the several states. So when a sovereign citizen asserts his own sovereignty, he is engaging in insurrection to some degree, although he might not be charged with it if the court or whoever is going to be charging him with a crime isn't interested in charging him with such a harsh crime. However, it is highly criminal to assert your own sovereignty and to then attempt to enforce it if you are within the territory of another sovereign country.
Right, right. You bring up some good points there, because oftentimes from a policeman perspective and then from a court perspective, they tend to confuse the court and tend to talk over the judge, talk over the policeman. Just concepts to a lot of people tend to argue just delay the process, because it isn't exactly the most efficient approach to try to get your way in the traffic stop or try to get your way in the court system. But I don't know if you had anything else to say about the sovereign movement in general. If not, we can move on to kind of the last example of a recent event that happened.
Yeah, I don't have anything specific to say about the movement in general. No.
Alrighty, then we can move on. I just wanted to make sure that you had all of the points you wanted. I think we should first talk about the movement, then we can go to the example. So, Moorish Americans are Moorish people. I don't know if they would like to be called Moorish Americans. Is a type of sovereign citizen movement. And essentially, they believe in a nationality of the sovereign movement. It used to be historically African American sovereign citizen movement, but recently it has become more diverse in the people who belong in the sovereign citizen movement. But it essentially believes in a culture that they call Moorish, and it extends from Morocco, if I'm not mistaken. We're going to scroll down.
Yes. So this idea of a Moorish nationality in the United States developed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and there's a religious group called the Moorish Science Temple of America, which is somewhat linked with Freemasonry, but also is its own thing, and it emphasizes the Moorish or Moroccan nationality, saying that they are descended from medieval Moroccans and ancient Moabites, and you also have an emphasis on Islamic religion. However, I will say that the Moorish Science Temple of America, or at least from what I've heard, has largely disavowed the groups that also call themselves Moors and that exhibit behavior similar to the sovereign citizens.
Right. And I believe the card I showed earlier was an example of a Moorish card in particular. Not that that really necessarily means too much, but just to give an example of it. But essentially, they believe a lot of the same beliefs of the majority of what we've discussed already. They just have a strong emphasis on the nationality part of the argument, and that the laws don't exist for them because of the old laws that they operate under, not the new ones that the government has now. But so recently there was a example of some Moorish Americans that okay, I guess we could start with what their intent was. So there was these groups of Moorish Americans that were led by one person in particular, and their idea was getting training. And you may be saying, getting training in what? Well, they were going to get training at the gun range. Some people were saying that they were a militia training, but really, that if you listen to the leader and if you believe the leader, which you don't have to necessarily, but they were training at the gun range. Now, the particular laws of Massachusetts are very strict in how you can travel.
Well, they were traveling from Rhode Island to Maine, and to do that you have to pass through Massachusetts.
Right.
And they were traveling by car, and they were also carrying a fuel tank with them, so that they didn't have to stop at gas stations on the way.
Right. And essentially, the reason that they got caught, you could say, or got eventually pulled over, and the escalation, and we're going to get to what the escalation was because of the laws, in particular in Massachusetts, about carrying of guns. There's very strict gun laws there, essentially you are allowed to travel with a gun, but there's very strict ways on how you're supposed to travel with the gun, and you can only travel with particular guns. And they were violating
Yes.
both of those laws. So eventually,
So what happened specifically
mhm,
on July 3rd is that they were stopped on the side of the interstate I-95 in
yes,
Massachusetts. They were stopping to open up the fuel tank to refuel their vehicles, and a policeman saw them and went over to see if they were in need of help, which is something that policemen usually do if they see someone on the side of a road. And he saw that they were armed individuals, and he asked them to identify themselves, and they refused to identify themselves, which then and then they retreated from the vehicles into a nearby wooded area, which led to the interstate being shut down and the local towns having uh, orders sent out for people to stay at their homes.
right. So they right, and long story short, they ended up all getting arrested eventually. So I believe that no one was hurt from the recent research I did before we started. But several of them have already been through the court system, at least the first part of it. But the leader yesterday just recently was at the court arguing his argument. And if you do want to listen to someone that isn't the typical sovereign citizen or Moorish American in the court, I would recommend searching that clip out, and I can definitely link it in the comments of this video. But he had a very different way
Yeah,
of arguing in the court system.
yeah. And I will say that as the event was happening, uh, he did uh, he did record some messages out for the Rise of the Moors YouTube channel. Um, so that is where this person's videos can be seen. And I think it's very important to emphasize that this person explicitly stated that he is not a sovereign citizen, and that he also respects the United States and its laws and is not anti government. Now, he also went on to state that he is a foreign national living in the United States and uh, displayed a flag. I couldn't quite identify the flag. However, it looked similar to the flag of Morocco. It might not be the flag of Morocco. Um, I'm not entirely sure, but he did display a flag saying that this is the country where we're from. Now, as far as I'm aware, I'm not sure that this person has any official non-U.S. citizenship, at least from any official government source. Now, I did go to their website, riseofamoors.org, and I looked at their frequently asked questions segment to get a look at what the movement is like. And it seems that they view themselves as foreign nationals living in the United States, which means that they consider themselves to be Moors or Moroccans, but that similar to sovereign citizens, they reject the idea that the United States is their government. Now, that being said, this man, as he was making the messages, was very clear, and he said that he didn't break any laws. Now, I'm not sure about that. I don't know whether Massachusetts has laws relating to whether you have to answer to the police when they ask you a question, or whether uh, how you should hold arms when you are on a highway, etc. So I'm not entirely sure whether that is a solid legal argument. But what I did note is that he did assert that the Moroccan government was actually sovereign over the United States, um, based on correspondence between the Moroccan government and the founding fathers, which is real correspondence, because Morocco was one of the first countries to recognize the United States. So it has a sort of long-standing relationship with the United States. But I think he's misinterpreting the polite language and respectful language that the founding fathers are addressing the Sultan of Morocco with as language denoting submission and subservience to the Sultan of Morocco and the Moroccan government. And I do not believe this to be true. I think that this is just simply polite language that the founding fathers were using, and that therefore his legal argument as to why Morocco is or Moroccans or Moors are sovereign over Americans and the American country, I don't think that that's a solid legal argument. But I think that that's also part of their ideology and religious beliefs to some extent, probably. So while they would not identify themselves as sovereign citizens, they do have a different understanding of the relationship of the sovereignty of the United States and the sovereignty of the American people, and specifically how the Moors are sovereign in the United States than what is under the regular statutes and acts of Congress.
Right.
And that is why they are considered sort of somewhat part of a movement, even though they have significant differences with the movement in general.
Right, right. It's a much more Pacific type, I would gesture to say, than the average sovereign citizen, you could say.
Yeah.
But on another thing,
because I think an important thing to emphasize,
Mhm.
an important thing to emphasize here is that the sovereign citizen movement is not a monolithic movement, nor is it a movement that can be clearly defined, in the sense that it has a number of overlaps with other movements, tax protest movements. You could say that there's probably a little bit of overlap with First Amendment auditors and other groups like that. So there is overlap with various groups, overlap with perhaps some anarchist groups even. So there's a continuum of sovereign citizens that fall into various categories, and sovereign citizen adjacent groups that might not be easily defined as sovereign citizens, but can be defined as having positions adjacent to them.
Right, right. I do think it's also important to mention that the particular leader of this event, and that it states it in this journal article as well, he was kind of seen as, I think it used the words of God, but I want to make sure I mentioned it in the right context here. A prophet. They said prophet. He was kind of seen as a prophet in the movement. Anyway, but the main point here is what I want to say is I think it's important to mention that in particular he was in the army for a little bit of time as well. So I think that it shows that he at least familiar to authority figures, because the army military is very structured in a way of authority. So I think that he knows about authority, and in a large way you could say him respects authority more than maybe the average sovereign citizen, potentially. I think that some people were saying that, and when it related to how he was arguing his case in court, because he seemed to respect the judge a lot more than most of the sovereign citizens, even that were arrested with him.
Yeah. So did you see the actual event in court?
I saw a about 6-minute clip of just him in front of the judge, and that was, I didn't watch any of the others, but I did see that clip.
Did he make any sovereign citizen type arguments?
He was very strong in saying that he did not understand the charges. Even when the judge read all the charges again and asked him again if he understood, he still said no, which is a common thing that they're never going to understand. He was also mentioning the fact,
but that can also be a tactic of other groups as well. So that's not really something specific to sovereign citizens, I would say.
well, maybe not Pacific, no, but is a strategy, I should say, that can be used. But
Yeah, because he did explicitly state that he was not a sovereign citizen.
right, which is important to know. But I would say that really he was very very timid and didn't really ask too many questions to the judge. But he didn't really seem to say anything either. It seemed like he took that approach of saying less is more valuable to me. So all he did was respond to when the judge asked him a question, and that was pretty much it. Now, when you actually get into the court case, he may have a lot more to say, but I think this was just the preliminary hearing of like, hey, do you understand why you're here type of thing. But no, he didn't really make
So
any
what were some
practical
of the
arguments.
charges? What were some of the charges put against him?
Some of the charges included having the weapons, the carrying of the weapons. Uh, there was something. Man, there was something essentially about a. I'm trying to think of how she worded it, but I'll just try to describe it. So there were several charges, and then the judge went on to explain each charge a little bit when he said that he didn't understand it. So the main thing the judge was emphasizing was the usage of the guns and the way the guns were carried. She also mentioned the factor of, I think she even used militia, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to go back and make sure that that is true. But there was also some claims on that. But a lot of them were relating to the usage of how the guns were carried. There were several charges relating to it, being the type of gun, the way it was carried, and a lot of charges relating to that. Let me see if I can't pull up it real quick here. Just to see.
Well, it's not particularly important, but we understand that this has to do with gun laws of Massachusetts, where the event occurred, because Massachusetts does have stricter gun laws than some other states, and I presume that by choosing not to refuel at gas stations, they wanted to avoid interaction that would lead to them getting in trouble for gun laws.
Mm-hmm. Right here it says that, just in case, there are 8 counts of unlawful possession of firearm, unlawful possession of ammunition, use of body armor in commission of a crime, possession of high-capacity magazine, improper storage of firearms in a vehicle, and conspiracy to commit a crime. Those were the charges that were laid against the majority of the people. So that's kind of what you were.
Yeah, I can see the internal argument from a Massachusetts court, because obviously, if they are traveling through Massachusetts in a way that does not follow the regulations of Massachusetts, and they do that premeditatively, then that would be considered a conspiracy to commit a crime. According to Massachusetts law, I would imagine. Now, of course, some people would argue that under their Second Amendment rights, that since they were only traveling on the interstate highway, that it shouldn't really apply to them. And I think an argument that they made was that under court rulings, that and this was an argument that they had made in one of their videos as the event was happening. So as they were on the interstate, standing there, they took a video and they said that they weren't breaking any laws, that what they were doing was legal under court rulings. Now, of course, I don't know exactly how the court would go on people traveling through Massachusetts, whether they would be subject to all the regulations of Massachusetts, or whether perhaps this has to do more with federal regulations. But I think a lot of this has to do with state level uh, stuff here.
Right, right.
But of course,
And
that's another thing that can happen with sovereign citizens is that they interpret their rights as allowing them to do things that the state government might take issue with, and then they take issue when the state government chooses to prosecute them for something that they may have already researched the state government wouldn't allow them to do.
right, right. A lot of times with videos I've seen, they tend to rely uh, oddly a lot on federal positions in federal court cases and things like that more than they rely on states. So like if it's the state argument, right? And I'm not really we're talking about Morris exactly here, even though they may be included in this as an argument. But oftentimes in videos that I've seen, they'll tend to point out a federal case, especially when it becomes to driving versus traveling, that they say, well, the terminology here should be traveling because of this court case. It's a federal court case. And they're like, well, sir, this is Maryland. You have to fit into what our law of what driving is here in Maryland because its traffic tickets are state by state, not federal. So, it's kind of an interesting thing that for a movement that tries to distance itself a lot from the government, tends to rely a lot on federal cases.
Yep. But I'd be interested in seeing how the case ends up going, because if it does get appealed, or let's say hypothetically it moves on to a federal court, if they are certain that their rights are being violated through these charges, their Second Amendment rights, then we could perhaps be seeing an interesting Second Amendment case. However, I would say that the fact that, as far as I'm aware, they had refused to identify themselves to the police and left their vehicles to go into the local woodland was something that made them suspicious to the police. And even if they may have already been armed, they probably wouldn't have gotten into as much trouble if they had identified themselves with proper ID.
Right. That's hard to say for certain, but I could definitely see the case where it would be a lot better for them. And who knows? Maybe we'll see something like this case or this case in Supreme Court even. Who knows? But it seems like they're only being charged in Massachusetts, despite traveling through the other states, which is an interesting concept as well. But once again, it goes to which state you end up getting caught in, per se, can charge you, unless they committed a crime on other. But anyway, that gets into the whole legal argument. But so it seems like they're just gonna get charged in Massachusetts, which is interesting. And they're probably going to be, in my opinion at least, I think that a lot of these are probably going to end up being guilty towards, and that's kind of my verdict of this. I don't think that they're going to have the opportunity to have a strong legal case.
Yeah, it all depends on what happens.
Right. We don't know. We don't have the fortune teller ball to predict the future.
Yeah.
Alrighty then. Well, I don't really have anything else to say, but I don't necessarily have anything else to say in particular to this case, but I do have just one general thing about the sovereign movement. So the whole concept of the sovereign movement to me, and we mentioned it before over the two types of sovereign citizens that exist. I think the people that are hardcore supporters of the sovereign movement believe in it because not necessarily because they necessarily think it's the most correct legal system per se, but okay, basically what I'm trying to say is I think even a lot of the hardcore supporters see a sovereign citizen as a way to have a loophole to the law, and I think that they believe that loophole exists, and that's why they like to identify themselves as a sovereign citizen. Now, does that exist in the experience of court cases? No. But as long as they believe it does, then that's why I think a lot of people are sovereign citizens. I don't necessarily think it's the other way around. I don't necessarily think that it's purely ideological more than it is a way to take an advantage of the system. That could be wrong, but that's kind of my
Yeah,
approach. I get.
and of course, there's other countries that have their own versions of sovereign citizens too, and in those countries, it doesn't go any better than it does in this country. And I think it's surprising that there's so many of these people, despite the fact that they don't really seem to win a lot.
Right, right. That's the weirdest thing to me. Uh, I haven't really seen a case where a sovereign citizen has won on YouTube. Maybe it does exist, but I've watched numerous videos and haven't come across one yet. So it's just it's a weird concept. It's a weird movement, but it's a movement that has a lot of people.
Yeah. And while I will say that I think that a lot of people, especially the people that only buy into the ideas and not into the actual practices, are not particularly dangerous. I do see where the FBI is coming from when they consider this to be a domestic terror threat, because it does, in one way, it does actually um, directly oppose the sovereignty of the United States over its citizens, which, while legally speaking, there's this idea that the people are sovereign, but the way that this is legally actuated is through representative government, and the states are sovereign together with the federal government. And this used to be actuated through representation of the states in the Senate, although it isn't anymore. Um, it is a threat against the federal government if individual citizens do consider themselves to be sovereign. Even if it is a very minor threat, it is a real threat, especially when people actually act on that and commit paper terrorism, or perhaps engage in violence against police or other government agents.
Right, right. I agree with everything you said there. With a lot of movements, I don't think a lot of movements are violent in nature. It's just the you could call it the radical few that are violent, especially when it comes to groups like this or any political group in nature. Not that sovereign citizen maybe not be political, but since they're involved in the legal system, any group that's like that is gonna have its members that are more radical than others, and could potentially.
Yeah, and it's like that for any violent group, really, because
Mhm.
you have a lot of people, let's say in Afghanistan, people that are supporters of the Taliban, but that don't actually fight with the Taliban, or a lot of people supporting Al Qaeda in various places, but they don't actually fight with Al Qaeda or the Islamic State, or the IRA in Ireland used to be around. There were a lot of people that supported it without actually fighting with it. And I think the same is true for any movement. So the radical elements of the sovereign citizen movement that you see on dash cams of a police car, you see them pull out a gun and gun down policemen, or you see them resisting arrest or putting forward weird arguments in courts. That is a small element. It is the more extreme element, but there's a larger, less violent iceberg underneath.
Right. It's just the people that people think about when they think about sovereign citizens are usually the more radical people. So that's a little unfortunate for them in that case, you could say. But that's with a lot of movements as well. More the radicals become the people think about when they think of that movement. Alrighty.
Yeah. But the real problem, however, is that the radicalization in some ways is a logical outcome of the ideas of a movement. And that is why it is considered a domestic terror threat, is because even if a lot of the people aren't radicalized, the radicalization seems to be a logical outcome of it. And therefore, there is that constant threat there.
Right, right. The logical end per se. Alrighty, I don't necessarily have anything else to say on this, but I will mention that next week will be on Anavota's channel on YouTube and eventually BitChute if you still upload to BitChute, right?
Um, Actually, on that, I think that the automatic uploading feature maybe has some problems with it.
Yeah, their website's a little sketchy sometimes on that. But anyway, next week will be on Anavota's channel, so you can definitely make sure to check that out. And also the same time, 10 a.m. Central Time or 11 Eastern Time. But I'll leave you with any last words if you have anything else going for your channel or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, I don't really have anything specific going on. See you all next week. Happy to have you, our beautiful audience.
Yes, thank you, thank you.